Okay, now let's talk about the difference between norm-referenced and criterion-referenced tests. Okay, so a norm-referenced test is used to compare a student's score to those of other students. Right, so the comparison factor is the peers, the other students who are taking the test. Okay, that is why it's called norm, because we're thinking that there is, because we're generalizing across people, that there is a norm in place that we're going to compare ourselves to. So these tests are usually reported as percentile rankings because this represents how a student's score compares with the scores of students in the test's norming population. Or, for example, that is the group of students, the norming group, who have already taken the same test. So usually these tests are, before they're let out to the public, they are tested out on a norming group where the person who is administering the test, who's designed the test, selects a group of students to represent the population, sort of lows, highs, and sort of middle-achieving students who represent different backgrounds, hopefully, take the test, and that is used as the norming group, right, and sets that norm. And you get a percentile ranking based on how well you perform on the test in comparison to that norming group. And that's what the percentile ranking ranks you as, okay? So, for example, a score of 71st percentile. So if you scored 71st percentile, what that means is that you did better than 71% of the students who took that test, right? Which, if you think about it, is a pretty good score. Right? Very different to thinking about 71%. Oh, I got 71% on the test, right? That's wrong. The 71% of the test is telling you how much of the information you got right on the test. 71 percentile means how you did, how you scored, how you performed in comparison to other students who took that test. So, for example, norm reference tests are also used to compare the performances of classrooms, of schools, districts, and even states. And some commonly used norm reference tests include, for example, the Stanford Achievement Test, SAT, the GRE, the TOEFL, which is a very popular English language assessment test for ELLs, and even international students who want to get into college in the United States. And it includes some other types of tests. For example, some IQ tests are also scored on a normed basis, and the result that you would get is from sort of, it's a percentile type of result. Okay, so let's talk about criterion. So now you know norm referenced is compared to others, right? Your score tells you how you scored in comparison to others. In a criterion reference test, this determines how much a student knows or has learned by tallying how many questions they answer correctly of the information that they're being tested on. So these tests are designed to determine whether a student needs more help, if they meet the specific criteria of the course that they're taking, if they meet the, for example, state standards. And these scores are usually reported as raw scores or are converted to percentages, as I said, right? So a score of 90% is what you would find for a criterion reference test, and that 90% tells you that that student was able to answer 90% of the information being tested correctly. Okay? As you can see that the scores are relative to a preset goal or objective, right? A criterion. So at some point you all have to take the general knowledge test. That's actually a requirement for 4081 is to take the general knowledge test. And so on that test, there is a preset goal where a passing grade is achieving, and I'm not familiar with this information as of now, but let's just say 70% of the information. So in order to pass this test, you would have to get a 70% or above, which means that they're expecting that you know at least 70% of the information in order to be designated as passing. Okay, So activity 2, let's go over sort of a similar style of activity that we just did. And I want you to think about the following statements and decide if they are criterion referenced or norm referenced, okay, in terms of the interpretation that you're going to make. Again, this activity sheet is found in the unit where you're watching this video. You can either use what you're seeing on the screen right now, or you can download that activity sheet, pause this video, take a look at it, and fill it out. You can write C for criterion or N for norm referenced. Okay, then we're going to come back and go over together. Okay, so number 1, Eric obtained the highest score on the reading test. Right, norm referenced, because the highest score meaning of the test, right, of the information of the test, right, of how fast he could read, for example. Number 2. Carlos can identify all the parts of a sentence. Okay, let's do this again. So, Eric obtained the highest score on the reading test. Okay, so what, I'm sorry, I had explained it as criterion. So the highest score, when we're talking about the highest score, we're usually comparing ourselves to other people, right? And so if Eric can obtain the highest score, then Marcy obtained the second highest score, right? So it's in the way that you're interpreting the test, it's norm referenced. Okay. Number 2, Carlos can identify all the parts of a sentence. This would be criterion because here we are focusing on the information at hand, right? So how many parts of a sentence can you identify? The number that you come up with would be criterion, right? Not norm reference, because there's no comparison group there. Okay, number 3, Connie can type 60 words per minute. Okay, this is criterion referenced, again, because it's a particular objective, right? It's not normed against anyone else, compared to anybody else. Number 4, John earned an average score of an arithmetic test, on an arithmetic test. Right, you see the keyword average. So this is how you know it's normed, because an average comes from summing up everybody, the scores that everybody has gotten and dividing it by that number, so that you can figure out what is sort of the median point in which people scored. And that is why when one says John earned an average score, you are essentially comparing him to everybody else that took the test. Number 5, Tanya defined only 20% of the science terms. Right? Criterion, because we're talking about the terms, the information, 20% of it. So if 20% wasn't part of the cutoff to pass, then Tanya definitely failed if she only defined 20% of the science terms. Number 6, Maria set up her laboratory equipment faster than anyone else. Okay, so that faster than anyone else should give you the clue that it is norm referenced, because you're comparing Maria to everyone else and the speed of them setting up the equipment. Okay, so now we're going to start thinking more about some of the issues with assessment, right? What is problematic about assessment for ELLs? And what I'm going to do is read you this little excerpt which sheds light on one of the essential problems with assessment. Okay, so fans of Garrison Keillor's National Public Radio program, A Prairie Home Companion, are familiar with the stories about his fictional hometown, Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. So the humor of this famous line is that it is mathematically impossible for all children to be above average. Okay, think about it. An average comes from everybody's scores, and so if everybody scores really well, your average is going to be much higher, right? It might be a 95, but there are going to be people that are below that average, okay? Because the average is supposed to represent the middle of what everybody performs. Despite this impossibility, the results of norm reference test scores have revealed a national pattern that puts most children at a rating of above average. Some refer to this phenomenon as the Lake Wobegon effect. How is this possible? Recall that these tests are first normed on a sample of students to establish what the average score is, the point at which half the students score above and half the students score below, right? We talked about that with the norm referencing. The tests are then administered to students throughout the country, and typically several years go by before the test is revised and new norms are established. Okay, so that first group of students that took that test, they're called the norming group, right? Those are the students that you're competing, sort of being compared against when you take that norm reference test. In the meantime, right, once this test has been released, and it hasn't been revised yet, in the meantime, teachers are becoming familiar with what is on the tests. With the pressure to raise the test scores, they teach to the tests. And if you haven't seen this yet, this phenomenon of teaching to the test yet, you will definitely be seeing this in your field experiences that take place in the spring semester. Usually it's a period of time that takes place about either probably the beginning of April, maybe the end of March, where the whole sort of school, all of the classrooms get focused on the FCAT test that is coming up. And so sometimes they will not even let university students go in to observe during those times because they consider that time very sort of pressure-based to teach to that test, to prepare students to get ready to take that test. The result is a test score inflation, right? Test scores go up, but there's no underlying gain in real achievement. Okay, so the test score goes up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the students know more, right? Or the students have more ability or more knowledge or have better academic language, right? All it does is show that those teachers are getting better at figuring out what's on the test, and the students are being sort of taught what's going to be on the test, right? And it's a little bit ironic, given that tests are actually supposed to tell us about what information the student has been learning in class. So the public thinks the students are getting smarter because of the rise of the test scores, but in fact, students are learning less because their instruction has been narrowed to only what is on the test. Okay? So this represents one issue with assessment, affecting all students, but definitely affecting ELL students as well. So let's talk about what is problematic about norm reference tests. So if you think about norm reference again, that is comparing the student to somebody who has taken the test before, right? And ranking them using a percentile to figure out how well did they score in comparison to other students who have taken this test. So a norm reference test does not tell us how well students do in answering questions or mastering concepts. That 71 percentile score doesn't tell you how many questions the student got right. It only tells you how well they did compared to everyone else. Okay? You also have to think about it. If all students respond correctly or incorrectly to all the questions, then all students would be at the 50th percentile, the average, right? Because you can only do as well as everybody else does, or as badly as everybody else does. Right, your percentile score is going to be representative of the performance of everybody else. So you have to be very careful with how you go about inferencing from that score. You also have to think about the population that they chose to norm the test on. Right, what is that norming group? ELLs are unlikely to ever be deemed above average because they're underrepresented in that norming group. Right, think about it. How many ELLs are they going to choose to be in that first group of students that they use to be the comparison stick for the rest of the nation? Okay, that is another reason why a norm reference test is pretty unfair for ELLs in terms of the basis of their information and their knowledge. Okay, so let's talk about problematic aspects of criterion reference tests. The cutoff scores that usually go hand in hand with the criterion reference tests are usually set by experts outside of the classroom instead of the teachers. It's also set based on subjective decisions, right? Not information or knowledge about what is going on, again, in the classroom. It's not based on a specific curriculum, but a general idea of what should be learned. And if you're thinking about K through 12 schools, this usually goes hand in hand with the standards. Okay, so the standards are not based on a specific curriculum, but just a general idea of what we think students should be learning at each level. And it's likely going to maximize the number of low-income or minority students who fail, because these cutoff scores are usually based on those mainstream middle-class white students, how they can perform, rather than giving a range of ability levels and performance levels from students with sort of different opportunities for learning. Okay. So when we compare norm reference tests versus criterion reference tests, the better option for English language learners is criterion reference tests, because at least they are not being compared, their score doesn't come out as being compared to a population that doesn't represent them at all. Okay, so the more fair option between these two would be the criterion reference test.